Hey everybody, this is Jill. Welcome back to my channel. This is week 2 of my Daniel Smith series. I'm covering a little set called Mineral Marvels, which is actually 36 of Daniel Smith's Primatek colors. So last week was the first episode. This is week 2, and let's just get into it. I'm going to switch over to the work area so that you can see everything that's going on here. So this is the little set if you've not seen it before, and last week I did the Oceanic series, and I'm just going to pull a new one out of the box. If you've not seen this before, you've got several different, there's 9 cards with 4 samples each, making a total of 36, and they're sort of organized by color theme. And so today we're just going to do the Metamorphic Black series. So in this series we've got the Sodalite Genuine, Zoisite Genuine, Hematite Genuine, and Black Tourmaline Genuine. So all of these are obviously going to be black values, black colors, and if you have the little set, you can actually, kind of look at the little sample sheet that comes with it, and it kind of gives you, a basic idea of what you're going to be getting into when you're starting to look at these colors. But they're over here on this section. They're definitely going to be these darker, muted black tones. So let's get into it. And if you've been with me last week, you know that when we're starting these little sample cards, the objective here is to not only find out what the colors are going to look like. We can look at our little sample sheet, and we've all made little color swatches like this to see what our colors are going to do. But it's just as important, I really need to know how these colors are going to behave in the different painting environments that I'm going to be using them with. So I'm going to show you how I do my own sample cards just to test and really push a color. So I've taken my spritz bottle and just sort of spritzed over each of these to sort of activate it. I'm going to do one color at a time, and make sure that you're using clean water every single time so that you don't contaminate and all of that good stuff. All right, so I'm just going to start right up here in the top corner. This is the Sodalite Genuine, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm sure somebody out there can let me know if I've said it wrong. All right, so I'm just starting with a little bit of clear water up here at the top. And the first test that I'm really kind of doing here, I want to see what the dispersion is like for this color. In other words, when it comes into contact with water, how does it behave? Does it sort of dart off into the water? Does it sort of stand still? Don't really know until I kind of try it. So I'm bringing the pigment into the dry paper right below the water, and then letting it slowly make contact with the water. And I can see that I've got quite a bit of dispersion, which is really nice. This is a highly granulating, as are all of these Primatek colors, and it has some really nice dispersion and takes off. I would say that it's definitely a bluish gray. Very beautiful color. All right, so I'm going to saturate my brush just a little bit more. I really want to come down. I'm going to leave a space and just kind of come in here and get the color as intense as I possibly can while still diluted. I don't want it to be just a paste. Like I definitely want to dilute it with a little bit of water, but I want to see what the darkest value is that I can achieve. And I'm just sort of making a little band there. I might even add just a little bit more just by dropping in a little bit of color, just to see really how dark that's going to be. And it is quite dark. All right, so I'm going to clear my brush out. And then just with some clear water, I'm going to start at the bottom of my section with clear water and bring this back up here. A little bit different behavior with the dispersion. We've talked about this last week. The color will behave a little bit differently when you start with water and bring a pigment to the water, and it's going to do something a little bit different when you begin with pigment and then deliver some water up to the pigment. The dispersion is a little bit different. It behaves a little bit differently, and that's just something that's good to know. I want to know what to expect when I start getting into this color and working with it regularly. All right, so I'm taking a little rigger brush, and I'm just kind of filling it up with water, and I want to just sort of do a few little spots. I want to see kind of how the pigment behaves when I introduce some water back into it. I also want to come in here, and I'm actually going to get a little bit of pigment onto my rigger, and I'm almost just painting some little grassy shapes with it. You know, as a landscape painter, that's something that I'm going to incorporate into my work often, are thin lines for grasses or branches. And I just want to see how this color behaves. It does displace the color a little bit. I get a little bit of a lighter value when I sort of go back into it with a little bit of moisture. The drops that I made, they really kind of pushed back nicely. Even as dark as this value is, I do get a lot of displacement when I add some water. I kind of need to know that. You know, a color that stains really heavily, like a phthalo blue or something like that, I'm still going to have maybe a little bit of pushback, but it's not going to give me a really nice light spot like that typically. So it's nice to know that I can do that with as dark of a color as this is. I'm also going to add just a little bit of salt down sort of at the bottom, and I might even take my spritz bottle and just give a little, let me prime this here. I just want to do a little spritz. There we go. All right, now these are all different water techniques that I use when I'm painting, so I just want to see what all can happen with just this one color. One thing that I do want to add, let me get a little bit more pigment on this brush. I do want to come in here and just add, drop some of the pigment in just to see how it behaves, see how the dispersion might take place with some pigment already on the paper. It's just kind of helpful to know. All this information is going to serve me later, and like I'd mentioned before in last week's video, it's almost like making a little tiny miniature landscape, if you want to think about it that way. So as you're doing your own sample card, think about the way that you're painting. Think about the things that you're doing while you're painting, the types of techniques that you use, and just incorporate that into your sample card, because you're going to see those behaviors again once you get into a painting. And so it's really nice to know what's going to happen beforehand by spending some time, working on these sample cards. It really does make a difference. All right, so I'm going to completely clean out my brushes. I'm going to set aside the sturdy water, and I do want to let my samples dry completely on their own. If I kind of use the hair dryer with these, especially with a salt effect, I'm going to lose all of the potential of everything of what that effect is, possibly going to do. So I don't want to do that. All right, so let's move on to our next color on the Metamorphic Black series here, and this is Zoazite Genuine. Now, I'm a little bit familiar with this color. It's very similar to Rare Green Earth, if you've used that, but I do think that it's, it is a little bit different. We'll look at the differences here. So I'm going to start again with some clear water, just as before, and I want to load up the brush, and I can tell just by working with it, the color, even though it's really dark, it is pretty transparent. I'm going to start below my water line, and I've got this beautiful green-gray tone, and then as soon as it hits the water, very dynamic dispersion. It really just takes off into the water. Absolutely gorgeous color. I'm going to load up the brush even more. I'm going to skip down, just leaving a little space, just so that I can contain that color, so that it's not moving or interacting with any other water on the paper. I just want to see how dark I can get this pigment, even if that includes getting back in here and sort of dropping a little bit in here. Beautiful, beautiful color. The granulation is extreme, and it is a very transparent color, and it does have this wonderful gray-green tone. All right, so now I've cleared out my brush, and again I'm starting with clear water at the bottom of my sample, and I'm going to work my way up to the color to make contact with the color. The dispersion behaves quite similarly. Over on the other side, it was a little bit different, and depending on your water balance, you're going to have different experiences. You know, depending on how big your color swatch was, how much water you had, how much pigment you had. But this is a great way to sort of play with all of these variables before you get into a painting. Play with it here to kind of get an idea of how the pigment is going to behave. It's always about the behavior of the pigment. We are learning some color information, but it's so important to know how the color behaves. All right, so I'm loading up my little rigger and just dropping a few little specks in here and there. And the granulation is just fantastic. I can imagine, you know, if I used this is my Arches 140-pound cold press that I'm practicing on. And I'll mention this again, you know, make sure you're practicing on your good paper, because if you don't know how the pigments are going to behave on your good paper, then there's not much point in practicing with them and then moving to good paper. You know, when it's time to do a painting, because you're going to get totally different results. I did want to load up my rigger with just some clear water to see if I get any displacement. Not a whole lot. It's mild. I know that if I used another pigment, maybe like the Quin Gold by Daniel Smith, it really likes to displace other colors that it comes in contact with, especially working wet on wet. I get some mild dispersion here, but displacement, excuse me, but it's not a lot. And I need to know that. So it does work better for this particular color. If I do want to have some extra strands, I need to just deepen the pigment and put it in there, sort of like so. All right, beautiful color. I am going to add a little bit of salt down here at the bottom and just a little spritz. I kind of just want to see, you know, what it's going to do over time as I let it sort of sit there and dry. But a beautiful gray-green color. Both of these look fantastic together, this blue-gray and this grayish green, and the granulation, of course, is just fantastic. Let me hold it up just so that you can see a little bit closer. The zoazite, it almost looks like charcoal as I get it closer to the light, but it does have a very distinctive green-gray tone to it. It's really wonderful. Here's another little tip. Just in seeing it, I've got my watermark, my Arches watermark right down here in the corner. So if you're like me and you paint with you buy your sheets bulk and you tear them down, you're left with the Arches watermark in a couple of corners. And sometimes you might not want that included in your painting. So use those corners, you know, if you're tearing down your paper anyway, use those corners to do color samples with, and then you kind of bypass adding them into any of your paintings. All right, so we've got a new color starting here. Let me get some more fresh water. All right, so this is the Hematite Genuine, and I know, or I'm just guessing by the name, that this is definitely going to be a charcoal gray sort of color. I'm going to, again, just the same exact pattern. And you know, you can start by following this pattern, especially if making sample cards is really new to you. But if you already know the different, you know, types of techniques that you want to explore, then go ahead and modify and sort of create your own sample card in the way that you would like to see it come together. All right, so I'm loading up the brush with this, and I can tell that even though I've really saturated this sample, it's a very transparent color. And I'm bringing it into contact with the water. I get some nice dispersion, and the pigment, you know, because it is kind of transparent, it's not quite it doesn't quite move as much as the others, but I can see that I can get some really nice little effects. It almost gives me these little, because there's the particulates, the little sediments that are in here, they're so heavy, they drop immediately right down into the little pits of the paper that they'll tend to not move very much, but I can get some nice little graduated effects that almost look like landscape features, like bushes or trees. And like before, I'm going to just drop down from that color section. You can see how transparent it is, even though I really loaded up the brush. Beautiful color. It almost looks like I've actually created my own watercolor with charcoal that I grind up, and this looks so similar to my charcoal pigment. Alright, so I'm trying to get this as dark as I can just to see what I could possibly get, and that's about as dark as I'm going to be able to get, I think. Alright, I'm clearing the brush, and then again I'm going to start with water at the bottom, making contact just to see what the dispersion does. The dispersion is minimal. Like I said before, these sediments are so heavy, they don't move very much. They really want to anchor down to the paper pretty quickly, so they're not moving too much. That's fantastic to know in the process of painting. You know, when I'm going through and working on a landscape, I know that I could push this color really hard into another pigment that's already wet, and it's not gonna run into it too much. And that's handy to know. All right, so I've loaded up my brush. I'm just gonna do the same kind of little grassy technique. I'm gonna clear my rigger, this time just with some clear water, just to see what kind of displacement. Again, it's gonna displace like not much at all. Those pigments, those sediments are really heavy, and they do not want to move once they've made contact with the paper. Beautiful color though. Very, very transparent. I've almost used this entire swatch. It's probably even more transparent than than the Zoisite Genuine that I just used, but absolutely gorgeous color. Very coarse granulation. I'm going to add a little bit of salt. Again, a little water spritz, and then just let that set. I did mention this last week in the first video. Each of the cards, the samples they're very generous, and if you flip the card over, there's just little information on each of the colors, where it's found, and it's really interesting. So a little bit of a geography lesson there too, in where these actual pigment sources of the pigment are, and it's just kind of interesting. All right, again, I'm going to start with clear water at the top and getting into this tourmaline, black tourmaline Genuine. Now, as I start actually working the color, I'm not really seeing so much of a green. It's really just a nice gray. Very similar in value to the hematite that I just used. Very similar in value, but the coverage is much better. The particulates are not quite as heavy, and I get a little bit more coverage. It's not quite as transparent. A beautiful, beautiful tone. It's really more of a charcoal. It does have, compared to this one is very monochromatic. The hematite is very monochromatic. It really just looks like charcoal. This one has got a little bit of color, just a little bit, and if I have to give my best guess, it is in the green family, but still very, very gray. All right, clear water coming up to the bottom, making contact. Okay, I get some nice dispersion, a very nice gradient. I'm going to take my little rigger. This is just some clear water. I want to see if I get some displacement. Look at that, I get a lot of displacement. See how it'll move the pigment out of the way? Just by itself, that can be such a wonderful effect for a lot of different landscape features. Even just water droplets that are just placed. If I let them alone and let them bloom on purpose, I can get a lot of visual texture. One of the reasons that I like the Daniel Smith Primatek colors to begin with is all of the visual texture that is created. really nice dark overlays. I can even come back in here and do a little negative painting in between little sections. The pigment, you know, the pigments that granulate pretty heavily, they are heavy, and that makes them sort of just sit still. You know, at least the color particulates, they like to just sort of sit in the paper and not move too much. So it's fun to kind of play with those and see what they're going to do. Again, it's all about the behavior of the pigment. I want to know what it's going to do when I actually start to sit down and try to incorporate it into a painting. And not only does it sort of set the stage for me understanding the behavior of the pigment, in the process, you know, I can start to see opportunities for how this color could serve me really well. You know, this color is just an excellent tone for maybe storm clouds or that type of thing. The zoazite, I had mentioned that it was very similar to rare green earth. I think it's a little darker, a little deeper in value, but the edges give you almost an instant, right out of the tube, distant tree line with no effort. The value is there, the color is there, everything about it is gorgeous in that way. And so those are some things that I want to look at and, you know, think about how these colors could serve me well in a painting. And I'm able to discover a lot of that information by really playing with this card and taking it beyond just doing a little square swatch. And then I'll do a little squirt. And honestly, I can't remember if I did one on the hematite. I'm not seeing the evidence of having done it. Let me just do it now. All right, so this is what we're going to do. I want to hold this up just so that you can kind of see the difference between these last two. They are very charcoal gray. They are practically the same value, you know, as I'm looking at them. But I do feel that this one, you know, the black tourmaline genuine, it's not quite as transparent. I get a little bit more coverage. This one, you know, the hematite, those little black particulates, they are extremely heavy and they really sit down on the paper fast, giving me this really strong granulation appearance. So what we're going to do right now is just let all of these completely dry on their own, and we'll come back and take a look up close to see what we've ended up with. Okay, here we are back with our Mineral Marbles samples. This is the second little series that I'm doing here, the Metamorphic Black series. And we had the Sodalite Genuine, the Zoazite Genuine, Hematite Genuine, and Black Tourmaline Genuine. So they've had plenty of time to dry on their own so that we can really see, you know, what the salt is going to do, what the water effects are going to do. And I'm just so pleased with the just dramatic, absolutely dramatic visual textures that we've got here. The blue in this bluish gray is just absolutely fantastic. And all of these, if you look at the whole sheet, you know, all of them, these granulate very, very heavy. Everything in this Metamorphic Black series had very significant granulation. But let's take a look at the Zoazite Genuine. This one's really similar in color and tone to the Rare Green Earth that I use, but I do believe that this is much darker and heavier, lots more granulation, just absolutely fantastic. And of course, if you're using rough paper, you're going to get even more dramatic texture because of the way that the little particulates are going to settle down into the paper. Absolutely fantastic. The hematite, it was probably the most coarse, I guess, if you want to call it that, the most severe granulation texture. It really looks like crumbled charcoal, like a charcoal stick, like you've taken sandpaper and scratched vine charcoal onto your paper and just sort of painted with it. It's absolutely gorgeous. None of these really gave me a lot of reaction to the salt. It maybe shows up a little bit more in the blue. You can see a little bit of the little speckles in there, but I think it's honestly because these granulate so much that the pigments are so heavy, they just don't move. The salt did not really generate enough of a reaction to cause any of the pigment to sort of move away from each of the little granules like you would expect to get that little starburst effect. It just did not produce, didn't produce anything really for me on this go around. I could try to experiment a little bit later, maybe on a larger sheet or something, but really didn't give me a lot of effect there. The black tourmaline genuine, it really has dried. I don't see any hint of green in this really anymore. There's, in the comparison of these two, you can see sort of the greenish gray tint here, but the black tourmaline, it's really a soft, warm charcoal color. It gives me, almost the same value as the hematite. We talked about that before, but I do get more coverage just because the pigment is a little bit lighter and is willing to move around and participate a little bit more and give me a little bit more coverage. But all of these are just absolutely gorgeous colors, and in fact I used some of them to create just a tiny little painting just to kind of see what I might be able to do to push these pigments. This is a little painting that I did for my members using these 4 colors plus a little bit of green that I used, but fantastic application for these with your landscapes. I hope you enjoyed this. Join me next week. We'll go through another series of 4 together.